quiero anunciar un poquito la dinámica de esta sesión. Ella va a hablar mostrándonos imágenes como la otra vez. Lo va a ir haciendo detenidamente porque hay conceptos muy, digamos, difíciles que ella nos quiere transmitir muy bien sus ideas. Y después vamos a pasar a los comentaristas. Tenemos a Daniel Inclán y a Javier Sigüenza, que van a hacer los dos comentarios, y haremos una ronda también, igualito que la sesión pasada. Pero después vamos a pasar a un evento de otro tipo, que es una producción sonora que vamos a presentar también como parte del proyecto de investigación que estamos realizando. Entonces, se los digo para que vean un poquito cuál es la dinámica. Entonces, iniciamos ya frente a la conferencia con Susan.
Thank you, Margaret, very much. I'm very happy to be here for a second lecture. This lecture is more difficult, perhaps, than the other. The language tends to be more poetic. It takes a position on the issues that Benjamin raises in the theses on the philosophy of history, which is perhaps not familiar to you, but I hope you will find them challenging and interesting. For those of you who are also in my seminar, you will see that the presentation on my first presentation on Tuesday and the one yesterday in the seminar, they all do somehow coalesce around issues or problems in the philosophy of history. And they may not look like they're about the same topic. They are not in some content sense, but they are as far as a certain set of theoretical premises are concerned. And I was explaining to Margaret and others before we got going today that, you know, I'm not an academic interpreter of Benjamin. I am someone inspired by Benjamin. And that means that I use him. And I also want to say that this is a political choice, not to simply follow or bow down in front of the great man, Walter Benjamin, because if he has given us tools with which to work, then it's up to us to work with him, and not to simply cite his beautiful language, but to try to make something with it, to try to actually work with it. And through my own writings, that's precisely what I try to do. I mean, a book like Hegel and Universal History maybe never mentions Walter Benjamin, but it could not have been written without his influence. So it's in that spirit that I would like you to accept my thoughts this afternoon. And I also want to make clear that the context in which this text was written. This one tries very hard to deal with theoretical issues in a harder, more difficult theoretical language, but it was instigated by a particular occasion. And I wanted to give you that context before I went into the written text itself. Could we have the first picture?
¿Cuál es la presentación? Está en PowerPoint. Está aquí ya.
As a big screen. Now you may wonder where you are with this. Can we have it as full screen? Good, thank you. I was approached by the curator of Documenta 13. Oh boy, I can't see. Carolyn Christoph Bagakiev, who curated Documenta 13 in 2012. She wanted me to work with an artist, and I suggested Emily Jassir. She said, oh, she's already one of our artists. I don't know if you know Emily Jassir's work. She is Palestinian, and she lives in the United States, so she has the right to travel to Palestine, and she's quite committed politically in her work. And I've always felt that the way she does politics is admirable. I like the way she does political art. And so I was excited to work with her. And so we weren't working really too closely together. What was happening was she was going about her work. I was in on the first stages of her thinking. Then I wrote my text, which you will hear today, and then she did her final exhibition for Documenta 13. So it was a give and take between an artist and a philosophical thinker about some of the same issues. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit about Emily's work. This image that you're seeing is one of her earlier projects. It was called Where We Come From. It consisted of photographs and related texts, and her starting point was this. She asked Palestinians living outside of Palestine, if I could do anything for you, anywhere in Palestine, what would it be? Because Emily Jassir could travel with her American passport to Palestine, but these other exiles could not travel back. And their answers were actually quite interesting. Here are some examples. Go to Haifa and play soccer with the first Palestinian boy you see on the street. This is that event. Or drink the water in my parents' village. Or bring back a photo of my family, especially my brother's kids. Or go to the Israeli post office in Jerusalem and pay my phone bill. Or go to my mother's grave in Jerusalem on her birthday and place flowers and pray. And finally, do something on a normal day in Haifa, something I might do if I was living there now. So you see the modest scale that Emily Jassir chooses for the nature of her political art. Could I have the next slide, please? This was a project that she did for the Venice Biennale, and it was a very simple project and looks rather harmless. What she did was have, you know, Venice was very influenced by Arab merchants, and there was a lot of give and take between the Arab world and Venice, and indeed the Renaissance would have been impossible without the influence of intellectual trends from the Muslim world. And so she wanted to refer to that historical connection by putting all the bus signs in Venice in Arabic as well as Italian. So this was the result, and unfortunately the municipality of Venice refused to have the project go forward, so it was never shown on the streets of Venice. So, the next slide. When Emily went to Kessel, which is where the Documenta exhibition takes place, all the artists who are contributing to the exhibition are invited beforehand to tour the location so that they can produce a project that reflects on the site of Kessel. And in Emily's case, she went to, could I have the next slide? She went to, and the next, good. She went to this place in Breitenau, which had been a concentration camp during World War II. But if you go back in the history, this concentration camp in 1933 was already a rehabilitation center. The building was attached to a monastery, and the monastery had been used in the past as a prison, and since World War II, it has been used as a girls' reformatory. Excuse me, the lower picture here is of the bathroom for the girls of the reformatory, and in this case, she notes that rather than being able to lock yourself in as a form of privacy, the doors were locked from the outside. The next slide. She also observed a library that had been the victim of Allied air bombing during World War II. And she discovered that actually library books, or books, do not burn, but the shelves, the wooden shelves on which they are placed, do burn, and this causes the destruction. So the question was, what do you do with the books to protect them against a bomb attack? Here they were put in the bunk beds of the girls' dormitory. Could I have the next? And this is a remarkable picture of what happens to books when they are subject to bombing. This kind of total collapse of the pages in the extreme heat. It does not destroy them, but it totally warps their shape. And I found this a rather compelling image. So these were the raw notes that I was sent by Emily. And I had a summer then to write some response. And it was a response that was about my own work, but did try to interact in some way with Emily's work. And so you'll see that some of these images appear again in the context of my talk. The next slide. Oh, no. The next. Yes, okay, that one should not have been there. We'll talk about that later. I think that it comes later. Okay, so the topic or the name or the title of my talk is, it has a very ambiguous title. In English, The Gift of the Past. But the word gift in German means poison. So the translation in German is Das Gift der Vergangenheit, the poison of the past. So I'm going to start reading the text. History is layered, but the layers are not stacked neatly. The disrupting force of the present puts pressure on the past, scattering pieces of the past forward into unanticipated locations. No one owns these pieces. To think so is to allow categories of private property to intrude into a commonly shared terrain wherein laws of exclusionary inheritance do not apply. No one owns the past. Yes? The history of humanity demands a communist mode of reception. The next slide. The goal of writing history is nothing short of a different world order. It requires rescuing the past based on a deprivatized, denationalized structure of collective memory. There is little danger of triumphalism in this task. Human universality is a scarred, wounded idea. And the sources of the scarring, the sources of the wounds, must be remembered along with history's moments of inspiration. Extreme inhumanities are a part of the communist inheritance of the past. The human disaster in Gaza, Palestine, cannot be made the legacy of Israel any more than the Holocaust belongs only to the Germans. Neither historical role, not that of victim, not that of oppressor, neither historical role is encoded in our DNA. Which means, of course, that if your ancestors were injured in the past, that is no excuse for you to kill others today. Next image. Next image. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, so the one before. Okay. This is Benjamin's phrase. Next image, please. Okay, this is called Separating the Image of the Angelus Novus from the caption that has captured it. Long ago, and it was very long ago, 30 years maybe, long ago, before the name of Walter Benjamin was globally famous, I asked my students in a seminar to consider the 9th thesis of his late text on the concept of history, and to draw an image that matched the description which he gave. And then I read that description to them.
Arreglamos las nuevas imágenes. Esta es la traducción. Ella está citando su traducción en inglés y es la más conveniente, es esta que vamos a citar ahorita, que es la traducción de Bolívar Echeverría. Hay un cuadro de Klee que se titula Angelus Novus. Se ve en él un ángel, al parecer, en el momento de alejarse de algo sobre lo cual clava la mirada. Tiene los ojos desorbitados, la boca abierta y las alas tendidas. El ángel de la historia debe tener ese aspecto. Su rostro está vuelto hacia el pasado, en lo que para nosotros aparece como una cadena de acontecimientos. Él ve una catástrofe única, que arroja a sus pies ruina sobre ruina, amontonándolas sin cesar.
If you know the thesis on history, you'll immediately see the image of Paul Klee's painting. But if you don't know that connection, you will not be able to tell from that description how Klee's painting looks. So when I simply read the description to my students and asked them to draw a picture of the angel being described, they did Christmas card angels and biblical angels and angels that looked like the description, but nonetheless did not look like Klee's painting. So that was my experiment. None of these drawn by my students resembled the Angelus Novus painted by Paul Klee in 1920, the painting that was purchased by Walter Benjamin shortly thereafter in the early 1920s. But today, the Klee watercolor has become famous because of Benjamin's reception of it. Indeed, too famous. The words of his text are so thickly applied that we cannot see the Klee painting without the overlay of Benjamin's comments on it. the elements therefore reverse. Rather than the text being a caption for the image becomes a caption for the text. Benjamin wrote his comments in a particular historical situation, 1940, as Hitler was advancing on Paris and he was forced to leave, and it was of course the last year of his life, because when he tried to leave by going across the Spanish border, he was stopped on the Spanish side and he committed suicide. That was the context, a terribly extreme situation. That was the context in which this connection between Klay's painting and the caption was made. But today, the picture is pinned down by the caption. It's caught like a butterfly, pinned. It's pinned down by the caption, pinned down by the determinations of a particular catastrophe, as if only that catastrophe matters, as if only it extends through all of history. In that sense, historical philosophy, or Geschichtsphilosophie, hardens into essentialist ontology. The world, without distinction, is called a prison camp. I'm referring here to Agamben's extension of this catastrophe to all of the world for all time. In other words, losing the historical specificity of the connection between the caption and the picture. How are we doing?
Es la misma, it's the same.
Es la misma.
Sí.
You mean I didn't save it? It could be. It could be.
So, what do we do?
Well, let's go there. It'll get better. But one of the things I had added were the translations. But go ahead. The next. Okay, stop there. We'll see. I'm sorry, because I tried to make it so much better this morning and I made it worse. So it happens. Okay. Oh no, go back one. Go back. Let's just look at the other one. Yeah, we'll stay there. Klay's picture hangs in the Israel National Museum, indelibly linked to Benjamin's suicide while escaping Nazi-occupied France as a permanent monument to the Holocaust. How did it get there? Karl Gerasi, who's a playwright, tells us in dramatic form, and he's historically correct, but he does it as a dialogue, or a dialogue would be two people. These are four people, posthumously, after their death, talking to each other on Mount Parnassus. He calls the play Four Jews on Parnassus, a conversation. And the four are Gershom Scholem, Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, and Arnold Schoenberg. And they are discussing with each other. Benjamin says, "What happened to my Angelus Novus?" Scholem says, "Oh, I'm getting to that." At the reception in Siegfried Unsel's home, and Unseld, some of you know, was the head of Surkamp Publishing Company. The reception followed Adorno's funeral in 1969. So at this reception, after Adorno has died, Scholem met, he says, "I met your son, the son of Benjamin, whose name is Stefan." Benjamin said, And, Sholem, I raised the question of the Angelus. Adorno said impatiently, what does raising the question mean? Sholem, I told him it was really mine. After all, by that time, I had read Walter's 1932 will. You know, he wrote a will in 1932, where he had left it to me. And I asked Stefan to instruct Adorno's wife, Gretel Adorno, to hand it over to me, because it was in Adorno's home, you see. And then he died, and then Sholem came to get it. And he said, I thought that I could take it back personally to Jerusalem. Benjamin then says, and Stefan agreed? Sholem said, he most certainly did not. Benjamin said, what? Sholem, he felt that since you had not killed yourself in 1932, ... Adorno, even more impatiently, come on, Gerhard, so what happened? Tell us. Sholem then says, okay, Adorno, your wife, Gretel, wrote to the famous Kornfeld and Klippstein auction house in Berlin for an estimate on the cost of the picture. And when she received it, it was clear to everyone that by 1969, we were talking about the most valuable item in Walter's estate. We all argued for nearly 3 years, during which the clay painting remained in Gretel Adorno's home, until Stefan, the son, died in 1972. So the poor man, Benjamin's son, Stefan, never really could enjoy the drawing. Sholem continues, I persuaded Siegfried Unseld to be the middleman. He went to London, settled with Stefan's widow, and got the picture from Gretel Adorno. I took it with me to Jerusalem. Now this is just my comments to you. Siegfried Unseld, the owner of Surkamp Verlag, or the director, unilaterally reduced the royalties from Benjamin's published works to be paid to Stefan's widow. Incidentally, she was a Filipino nurse who had no idea about critical theory. And so she and her 2 young daughters got a very reduced royalty. Sholem kept the painting in his Jerusalem home until his death, when his widow was persuaded to donate it to the Israel National Museum. So that's the story of how the painting is now in the possession of the Israel National Museum. Okay, so there's supposed to be a word, a title. It says transitoriness. This is the theme right now, transitoriness. Okay? Benjamin's own reading of Clay's painting kept changing. This is the point I want to make. Benjamin's own reading of the Clay painting kept changing. It was never locked in. Angels, for him, were ephemeral creatures, transitory creatures. In 1922, he planned a topical journal under the name Angelus Novus, wherein theology and current commentary were to be one and the same. In 1931, and this is what I have an image of, Benjamin bestowed the name Angelus Novus on somebody else, and that somebody else was Karl Kraus. I have a picture of him, and I have a picture of the journal that Karl Kraus edited, and it's called Die Fackel, the torch, and it's totally in red, and it's furiously angry, and Benjamin calls Krauss the Angelus Novus because he's furious at what the newspapers are doing to the German language. They're butchering it, and he hates it, right? And so he writes in a journal, in a periodical that comes out very frequently, he writes these damning criticisms of journalistic language. And Benjamin calls Karl Kraus the Angelus Novus. In other words, the meaning of the image to him was totally different. Totally different. And then Benjamin compares this torch-bearing, angry man, Karl Kraus, with a woodcut of a prophet with his hair standing on and coming screaming in, talking of, disaster and catastrophe, right? And I found an image that looks just like this, and I had them juxtaposed to the cover of De Facto. And you see how this kind of prophet of doom, the image, incidentally, is of Elijah, the prophet from the Old Testament, who is, warning the people, right? So this, then, is the meaning that Benjamin gives to it in 1931. Then, Benjamin changes the caption of the painting one more time. He identifies himself with the angel. Well, before he identifies himself with the angel, or even at the same time, who knows, he describes the Angelus as a woman, the female counterpart of himself, or indeed as himself, in pursuit of a woman. Can we go back to the picture of the Angelus Novus? Yeah. Now can you imagine Benjamin sees himself as about to pounce on this woman whom he's found in Ibiza in 1933. Her name, she's Dutch, and her name is Anna Maria Blaupotenkate, whom he met in Ibiza in 1933. Benjamin sees himself as the suspended, if voracious, angel, ready to pounce on the woman that he desires. But he is receding as time takes him backwards. Still he hovers with persistence. And I'm quoting Benjamin here. In short, nothing could weaken the man's patience. And this refers also to the fact that Benjamin was often in love and never seemed to fulfill his desires. He was always somehow hesitant and never really connected with Asialakis or others. I mean, it's depressing to read his love life. So he identifies himself as this Angelus Novus. Just to give you an idea of the way he worked with the caption and its connection to the image. It changed. So this is how he understood the relationship between image and caption. The caption was erasable, replaceable, ephemeral, like the songs of Talmudic angels. And that refers to something I didn't read, which is when he's describing Karl Kraus, he compares Kraus to the Talmudic angels. Angels that sing once and then are gone forever. They're so transitory. Right? So these images, it's just to give you a feel of the semantic potential that Benjamin gave to images in his own work. And
here we go. This is a very difficult point to explain, and I'm going to do it more as I would teach a class than as a formal presentation. I had made a diagram that I thought would be helpful because it's one of the most difficult ideas in Benjamin's thinking. So I will try to do justice to the idea in a much more informal fashion. Here is the text that I am going to be referring to here, for those of you who are experts in Walter Benjamin, is on language in general and on the language of human beings. This is an early text, and it talks about God's creation and Adam as the namer of God's creation. And this idea becomes very constant in Benjamin's thought. So let me just try to explain it in a very plebeian way. For Benjamin, art is just one form of human creation, no more or differently to be evaluated than any other. So for instance, an architectural style or a building style like the arcades is one form of human creation. Gas lighting is another form of human creation. These are equal for him as far as their potential semantic power. All of the forms consist of human shaping of matter. But material, the matter that human beings create with, is not their creation. The material world is God's creation. Its distinguishing sign is transitoriness. It manifests its divine origins by eternally passing away. You have to think of the Adam and Eve beginning of humanity here. And you have to think of God creating, in Genesis, the world. He creates a world that passes away, that has transitoriness as its very essence. And this created natural world is then recreated or worked upon by human beings who turn it into forms, buildings, or any other human creation. So in the early text on the theory of language, Benjamin talks about God creating the world, but Adam naming it. So the kind of production of the meaningful object is what human beings do, but they do it not out of themselves. They are working with God's creation. And this sets up for him a notion of the divine and therefore of truth as connected with the transitory, with the ephemeral, with the non-lasting. And then he puts together a notion of human utopia, social utopia, based on human happiness and indeed material satisfaction. A concept of utopia which is totally secular. He speaks in the Theses on History about women who might have given themselves to us as a possibility in human life for happiness. And for him, this is absolutely the other side of the divine. So the secular and the divine, the Marxist and the theological or messianic are not separate for Benjamin. They are one and the same. Right? And this combination of the divine and the transitory is very counterintuitive to us trained in Plato, Aristotle kind of Western philosophy. Right? So this is an extremely difficult idea, and he gives us an image in another text called the theological political fragment. The theological political fragment. And in this text, he talks about two arrows facing in different directions. One going like that, and one going like that. And this is what I did this nice graph about that I thought made it more clear. And the backward one is this kind of constant disappearance of material life, right? And the other is a human life that goes forward for the time that we are here. And the intersection of these two, the divine and the human, converge in a notion of transitoriness. Right? Now this idea, which combines the materialist notion, God's creation, with God himself, with the theological, not as two separate realms, but as two sides of one reality. This remains so constant in Benjamin's thought that this theological political fragment, which has the image of the opposite facing arrows, that image in the fragment is still disputed as to whether it was one of his earliest texts written in the early 1920s or whether it belongs to one of his very latest texts. So that's kind of what I wanted to tell you about that. I hope at least it gives you some idea of the ambiguity of these terms for Benjamin, but also the simultaneity of what to us would seem to be opposing conceptions. So secular happiness and divine truth, or let's say messianic truth, are in synergy, each augmenting the other in time. Okay, that's all I'm going to try with that concept without our images, etc. Okay, so see if this makes sense to you now. The passing presence of the material world and of human happiness in it leaves us with the metaphysical necessity of affirming transitoriness, because only in passing is truth available to us. The image of truth is time sensitive. It is not that truth changes, but we do. So it means, if you look at the theses of the philosophy of history, so often he talks about how the fleeting nature of truth, the truth can run away from us. Nothing can be grasped in some sort of definitive way. So one has to allow time to go through one's fingers in order to have fulfillment in time. So the eternal is eternal transitoriness, not permanence. Let's see if we can have an image. Let's try another. And another. Yeah, this is what I want. The others are all out of order. Just forget it. It's a damaged file. Legenda, that which is to be read. Creyenda, that which is to be believed. So we're talking now about collective memory. And remember my point at the beginning that memory or history should be inherited in a communist form. The remembered past is preserved in stories. As part of collective imaginaries or collective imagination, it becomes legend. What is too terrible in an individual's experience cannot be remembered. cannot be made a story. In story or legend, individually lived experience is whitewashed in the process of collectivizing it, cleansing it of what is truly terrifying, and that is ambiguity. I hope that makes sense. When legends are appropriated by power and fixed to objects, lifting these objects out of history and preserving them within a nimbus of absoluteness, absolute terms, differences, good, not evil, right? Or right and wrong, redeemed and damned, the dividing of the world, the bifurcation into the good and the bad, right? This is what legends do. This is what stories do. There are good guys and there are bad guys, right? But this is not the way individuals experience catastrophe. They experience it, or they experience life in a much more ambiguous way. And you know, Adorno himself, this is just an aside, was always, you know, Adorno survived. It's always a problem, because by surviving, someone else does not. So the actual individual experience of these terrible things can never be, I am good and they are bad. It's always much more complicated than that. Legends, if they become collective, it's we are the good people and then our enemies are the bad people, right? If they become collective in this partial way, legends become orthodoxy, setting the patterns of right belief. Such legends are formed out of irreducible and unchanging elements that refer to mythic constructs. Here are a few of the mythic constructs: the nation, the West, the terrorist, the Muslim, the Jew. These constructs, reassembled in various ways, police how the past is to be read, thereby securing the borders of orthodoxy in a way that violates the historical fundament of transitoriness. When the past is fixed and constrained within a timeless medium, collective memory becomes a mode of entrapment. Once the sense of the world is formulated in this way, history enters a magic circle of political theology, which works like this. Right belief legitimates power, and power legitimates right belief. And the circle is complete. Orthodox remembrance is capable of performing murder on the material world. Not only what has been in history, but what exists today. Collective memory becomes conformism. Anyone who remembers differently is suspect. And then I had a slice of that image that I showed you by Emily Jasir of the bathrooms of the girls' reformatory, and I say in my text, doors locked from the outside. In other words, we are locked in a certain interpretation of what our history is, what our orthodox belief is. Control of how the past is inherited is therefore no small matter. Archives, museums, libraries, legal traditions, institutional records, all of these are storehouses of the past. Their benefactors supervise the production of orthodoxy. Even if religious and secular ruling groups are often in competition with and among themselves as to determining just what orthodoxy is. But even a book or an image can be threatening if it escapes the particular manner of reading that is affirmed by those in power. Archivists and scribes, artists and academics, that is we ourselves, find our patrons within this ruling milieu. Indeed, learning is the passion of the powerful. The symbiotic relationship between knowledge and power is critical for maintaining order. Rulers cannot survive its loss for long. But orthodoxy of belief is in constant danger of being undermined by the knowledge process itself. Storehouses of the past, that is archives, libraries, etc., harbor evidence of errors, of ambiguities and complexities, not to speak of outright lies, that discredit official belief and threaten to topple collective legends. If you try to produce knowledge without a patron, and we can think of Walter Benjamin in this context, he had no patrons. This production of knowledge without a patron has been described by a well-known historian of religion, Jonathan Z. Smith. Production of knowledge without a patron has been described as apocalyptic in its historical implications. It's a very interesting idea. In times of struggle between the guardians of power and the guardians of truth, historical evidence becomes a prophetic weapon. The rulers claim the role of the restrainer, the catacon, if we're going into the apocalypse. Yeah. The constrainer holds disorder at bay. That's what the rulers do. But the prophets protest against the given order in the name of human happiness and social justice, and even God's will. History writing is the place of this struggle between the need to preserve present order and the desire to preserve truth. But here is the irony. If the preserved past is entrusted with the task of bearing witness to truth, if the producers of meaning treat the artifacts of the transient material world with a reverent care close to worship, then how is this painstaking effort to be reconciled with the fact that the past is never given to us whole? Maybe we can have the next image. Oh, the door is locked from the inside. Oh, we have a few of them in the right order. The next. We're locked from the outside. Oh, good. At least this is there. Okay. Oh, but at this point, you're supposed to have the image of Emily Jassir's melted books. That horrible image of the melted books. That was supposed to be before this. That which survives in archives does so by chance. Disappearance is the rule. Annihilation is the fate of whole cities, obliterating far more of the human record than is preserved. Wars and disasters of nature are indifferent destroyers, but human intention is at work as well. Heresy, degeneracy, degenerate art, thinking of Hitler here. Blasphemy, treason, disbelief. These are just some of the threats to orthodoxy that call for destruction of the historical record. Texts and images are both vulnerable to attack. Precisely which objects are available from the past, whose written and visual sources are saved, is therefore astoundingly arbitrary. Only a confirmed believer in history as meaningful could be sanguine about their providential arrangement. In other words, if you think you can read meaning into what arbitrarily was salvaged from enormous destructiveness of the past, you know, you are such a believer in the potential of history to be meaningful that it's difficult, right? I mean, think how arbitrary it is, what we have. I mean, we can think of the indigenous, but not just them, right? It's enormously arbitrary, and yet we, moderns, look to history for truth. Great libraries disappeared. Over 500,000 manuscripts, these are the libraries that have disappeared. Each of them contained over 500,000 manuscripts that then were lost or destroyed or moved to some other location. They are the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, which disappeared by the 5th century, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate, the Library of Cordoba under the Andalusian Umayyads, and the House of Wisdom in Fustat, now Cairo, under the Fatimid Caliphate. All of these were huge centers of archival knowledge. Now, Europe, incidentally, was very late to have a major collection. The Vatican Library held only 1,160 volumes when it was formally established in 1475. But intentional destruction by the Catholic Church was common. 2 cases connected with religious and imperial expansion resulted in irretrievable loss. Maybe we could have the next. Doesn't matter. I'll tell you what the next one says. Under the Spanish Inquisition in Granada in 1499, there was a public The next, please. No, back. Okay, we're missing a slide. No, there's one other. It's okay. I'll tell you. Because it's interesting, this is the one that's so close to you all. The Mayan sacred books were obliterated by the Spanish bishop of colonial Yucatan in 1562, along with 5,000 diabolical cult images. So imagine what we do not have. What we do not have. Wikipedia lists 87 historical instances of book burning. But the act itself is not the issue. It's not just book burning that's the problem. What I'm concerned about is the loss of the past. There is no direct continuity between past and present in the 87 instances, at least not for the point that I am making. I mean, in many cases, a library was burned, but there was a duplicate copy someplace else. So what I'm concerned with is the absolute disappearance of knowledge. Now we should have, exactly, good, the destruction of Bosnia's National University Library in Sarajevo. Now, if earlier it was false religious belief that was under attack, now the enemy takes on ethnic and racial tones. Modern states establish libraries and archives as guardians of the imagined national community, those who claim a right to the land by birth, natio, right? Nation states. Patriotism has appropriated the aura of religion. It purifies present acts of violence against perceived enemies, whose own past is first defiled and then destroyed. Ethnic archives are obliterated. National libraries come under fire. Recent casualties include, the next slide please. So just very briefly, the Irish National Archive was destroyed in 1922. The Catalonian Library was destroyed by Franco's troops in 1939. The Judaica collection in Birobidzhan, the capital of the Soviet Jewish Autonomous National Zone, established as a socialist alternative to Zionism, was destroyed in the anti-Semitic climate of Stalin's last years. The Zaluski Library in Warsaw, founded in the 18th century as one of Europe's first public libraries, was destroyed with the burning of the city as punishment for Warsaw's anti-Nazi uprising in 1944. Jaffna Public Library in Tamil-dominated northern Sri Lanka, 97,000 volumes were destroyed, including rare palm-leaf volumes. They were destroyed by the Sinhalese paramilitary in 1981. Statues of Tamil cultural or religious figures were also destroyed and displaced. Bosnia's National University Library, you just saw its destruction in Sarajevo, was shelled and burned by Bosnian Serb gunners in 1992. The library, incidentally, held 1.5 million volumes, including over 155,000 rare books and manuscripts. Next image. The National Museum and Library of Iraq in central Baghdad, destroyed during the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Statues and other ancient artifacts were looted or destroyed. There is also a less violent, more common form of erasure. It is the practice of preserving only our past that provides a continuous linear trajectory for imagining our future. The next slide, I hope. Yes. Archaeological dig in Israel. Archaeologists dig quickly through layers of history to find what is of interest to present power. Attention to mythic origins, the stuff of national legend that shores up the dominance of those who rule, dismisses the recent past as refuse. The recent past is its ground is a mere construction site for future growth. You destroy the recent past to make something more modern and to grow and expand, right? In the process, material evidence of crimes against living beings is destroyed. And the only reason that this is a picture of Israel is to keep the thematics with a Palestinian artist, but I could show pictures of the destruction of Armenian neighborhoods in Turkey, or, this is a universally problematic situation. The next. So, living beings, their recent past is not important. Their records, declared of no value, disappear, and with them, the possibility of imagining any community at all. Excavating the earth in search of the cultural heritage of a particular people, while bulldozing the counter-evidence, poisons present consciousness by shrouding it in myth. One finds only what has already been determined to be there. Now, you can say any national construction of a history does that. It is looking for its common national past. So it already knows what it will find. And if strangers are there, they're not part of the story. Maybe an image. Yes, and I was going to have underneath it the translation of Bolivar. So, for it is an irretrievable image of the past which threatens to disappear in any present that does not recognize itself as intended in that image. But if you go deeper into the historical evidence, below the level of official legend, it becomes clear that our past has never, is not, and has never been our own. Objects survive through trading hands. Books move and thrive in diaspora. Scholarship flourishes through cosmopolitan exchange. Texts and artifacts follow the lines of pilgrimages, troops, and trade. Now, empires monopolize knowledge through linguistic appropriation, supporting what have been called the great translation movements that have marked the rise of their power. When a civilization rises in power, it translates everything into its own language. In the case of the ancient Greek texts, Ptolemy's astronomy, Galen's medicine, Plato and Aristotle's philosophy, all of these human achievements owe their survival to a series of imperial languages, the heritage of ancient Greece, lauded by Europe as its own. Passed first from Greek into Persian translations under the Sassanids, and then into Arabic under the Abbasids, and ultimately into Latin at Toledo and Sicily. And they were the precondition for the European Renaissance. When in Europe, vernacular languages replaced Latin as the language of power, translations became a strategy of intra-European imperial competition. The last great translation movement after Europe's decline has been into English, the language of my text. So we face an uncomfortable fact. Without empires, no cultural heritage. Without diasporas, no national past. The Iraqi National Museum was not founded by Iraqis. It was founded under imperial mandate of the British. And the British are now spearheading its present restoration. Sarajevo's Oriental Institute, destroyed in the Civil War, housed a Bosnian past, that picture I showed you of the destroyed library, a Bosnian past, and I put that in quotations, that included ancient manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, and not only Adzambijski, which is the Bosnian Slavic language that is written in Arabic script. So our past is possible precisely because of those who are not considered part of our story. Today, microfilmed and digitalized replicas of manuscripts lost in wartime allow the restoration of centers of learning. Electronic collections promise to prevent effective obliteration. the internet is really perhaps important in this regard. Has global communication then made imperialism's appropriation of knowledge obsolete? It has to be remembered that 80% of the material on the internet is in English. We are going to try another image. Oh, that's a nice one. The next. Oh, this is what I was going to show you. So that one made it for some reason. This. Oh, good. And it matches what I just said. Bravo. Okay. Next slide. Yes. We may be okay now. I call this section Revolutionary Patience. In a time when Europe's imperial nations were engaged in unprecedented human destruction in the name of partial political identities, Walter Benjamin had good cause to hover like Clay's Angelus Novus, rejecting all existing alternatives. This hovering prophet of the apocalypse, who could find no patron in power, was not one to take moral categories of good and evil and reverse their references, whereby past victims of history are glorified as present conquerors. He wrote in 1938, "Wrongs that are endured are apt to foster self-righteousness." This has been true for the scholars who have emigrated. It's a very damning statement. We are the good ones. Benjamin desired a home in Europe which gave him no refuge, not Germany, not France, and not Spain. He distinguished the Zionist movement as a political organization from his own spiritual identification with certain ideas that even if a German expressed them, he defined as Jewish. And this is really a beautiful quotation of Benjamin. "First and foremost, I must affirm what in me is valuable. And should someone say to me that this valuable aspect of myself and other Jews is not Jewish," that is, for instance, German, right? "I cannot regret that for a moment." For him, a weak messianic power belongs to the entire living generation. Those human beings who share this moment in time, not to any particular ethnic or religious or national collective. He did not choose to go to Central Park in New York, where Adorno and the Institute for Social Research waited for him. He did not go to Israel to join Gershom Scholem, or to Moscow, where his early love, Asya Lakis, was politically engaged. Or he did not seek an ultimate return from exile to the communist East Berlin, where his friend Bertolt Brecht lived out his natural life. Because of his indecision, or was it revolutionary patience, Benjamin's legacy belongs to no one particular place and is open to all of us today. Let's see if we have another image. Yeah, okay. The temporal matrix in which truth is embedded, essentially transient, is the criterion for critical judgment. This is a difficult idea, because it goes against conventional procedures that narrate history sequentially and at a distance. In view of the fleeting nature of truth, any attempt at permanence of historical interpretation leads to error. The situation demands a new form of exegesis, one that rescues the legibility of the past against the conventions of official memory. The next image. If progress yields a constant heap of debris, this is due to the continuation of the same: war's destruction, economic exploitation, and turning the other of one's own collective identity into a scapegoat as the political enemy to be exterminated. Interrupting the interminable repetition of the same necessitates remembering the past through those present in humanities of which one is at this very moment an accomplice. So here it is someone else's past, someone else's present that needs to come into the picture. Past events cannot provide a key to the present unless they are radically separated from a direct lineage of inheritance. If, on the contrary, the layers of history are superimposed in a way that only one's own history can be read through them, then the horrors of the past are repeated precisely in the process of paying them infinite due. In other words, we remember our own victimization. And as we remember it, we make victims of others, right, in the present, as we, people alive today. So never again ends up being always the same. Benjamin speaks of smashing the continuum of history. Karl Otto Werkmeister insists that this process entails violence. Benjamin's language is violent. He uses military terminology, and Werkmeister says terrorist metaphors, in order to blast apart the dominant historical narrative. In this process, the past is blasted, right? And it ricochets off the present, scattering into enemy territory. Historical fragments are the remains of an explosion. Blasted free of official memory, the fragments of history are preserved as images. They retain the nearness of original experience, and with it, of course, ambiguity. Their meaning is released only in a constellation with the present, and that constellation will be transitory. These constellations of the past and present harbor a warning. The gift of the past is a Trojan horse. One thinks one knows whence it comes and to whom it belongs, but the gift is to others. Those, the so-called rightful heirs, are presently destroying. Image, I think. Image. There is nothing in human history that is foreign to us. And the next. This is Emily's work again. But what if you cannot read what is written by the image? The next. And the next. Whom will you trust to tell you what it says?
Thank you. Boy you see on the street. This is that event. Or drink the water in my parents' village. Or bring back a photo of my family, especially my brother's kids. Or go to the Israeli post office in Jerusalem and pay my phone bill. Or go to my mother's grave in Jerusalem on her birthday and place flowers and pray. And finally, do something on a normal day in Haifa, something I might do if I was living there now. So you see the modest scale that Emily Jacir chooses for the nature of her political art. Could I have the next slide, please? This was a project that she did for the Venice Biennale, and it was a very simple project and looks rather harmless. What she did was have, Venice was very influenced by Arab merchants, and there was a lot of give and take between the Arab world and Venice, and indeed, the Renaissance would have been impossible without the influence of intellectual trends from the Muslim world. And so she wanted to refer to that historical connection by putting all the bus signs in Venice in Arabic as well as Italian. So this was the result, and unfortunately the municipality of Venice refused to have the project go forward, so it was never shown on the streets of Venice. So, the next slide. When Emily went to Kessel, which is where the Documenta exhibition takes place, all the artists who are contributing to the as a big screen. Now you may wonder where you are with this. Can we have it as full screen? Good, thank you. I was approached by the curator of Documenta 13. Oh boy, I can't see. Carolyn Christoph Bagakiev, who curated Documenta 13 in 2012. She wanted me to work with an artist, and I suggested Emily Jacir. She said, oh, she's already one of our artists. I don't know if you know Emily Jacir's work. She is Palestinian, and she lives in the United States, so she has the right to travel to Palestine, and she's quite committed politically in her work. And I've always felt that the way she does politics is admirable. I like the way she does political art. And so I was excited to work with her. And so we weren't working really too closely together. What was happening was she was going about her work. I was in on the first stages of her thinking. Then I wrote my text, which you will hear today. And then she did her final exhibition for Documenta 13. So it was a give and take between an artist and a philosophical thinker about some of the same issues. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit about Emily's work. This image that you're seeing is one of her earlier projects. It was called Where We Come From. It consisted of photographs and related texts, and her starting point was this. She asked Palestinians living outside of Palestine, if I could do anything for you, anywhere in Palestine, what would it be? Because Emily Jacir could travel with her American passport to Palestine, but these other exiles could not travel back. And their answers were actually quite interesting. Here are some examples. Go to Haifa and play soccer with the first Palestinian boy.
Quiero anunciar un poquito la dinámica de esta sesión. Ella va a hablar mostrándonos imágenes como la otra vez. Lo va a ir haciendo detenidamente porque hay conceptos muy, digamos, difíciles que ella nos quiere transmitir muy bien sus ideas. Y después vamos a pasar a los comentaristas. Tenemos a Daniel Inclán y a Javier Sigüenza, que van a hacer los dos comentarios. Y haremos una ronda también, igualito que la sesión pasada. Pero después vamos a pasar a un evento de otro tipo, que es una producción sonora que vamos a presentar también como parte del proyecto de investigación que estamos realizando. Entonces, se los digo para que vean un poquito cuál es la dinámica. Entonces, iniciamos ya frente a la conferencia con Susan.
Thank you, Margaret, very much. I'm very happy to be here for a second lecture. This lecture is more difficult, perhaps, than the other. The language tends to be more poetic. It takes a position on the issues that Benjamin raises in the theses on the philosophy of history, which is perhaps not familiar to you, but I hope you will find them challenging and interesting. For those of you who are also in my seminar exhibition, are invited beforehand to tour the location so that they can produce a project that reflects on the site of Kessel. And in Emily's case, she went to, could I have the next slide? She went to, and the next, good. She went to this place in Breitenau, which had been a concentration camp during World War II. But if you go back in the history, this concentration camp in 1933 was already a rehabilitation center. The building was attached to a monastery, and the monastery had been used in the past as a prison. And since World War II, it has been used as a girls' reformatory. Excuse me, the lower picture here is of the bathroom for the girls of the reformatory. And in this case, she notes that rather than being able to lock yourself in as a form of privacy, the doors were locked from the outside. The next slide. She also observed a library that had been the victim of Allied air bombing during World War II. And she discovered that actually library books, or books, do not burn, but the shelves, the wooden shelves on which they are placed, do burn, and this causes the destruction. So the question was, what do you do with the books to protect them against a bomb attack? Here they were put in the bunk beds of the girls' dormitory. Could I have the next? And this is a remarkable picture of what happens to books when they are subject to bombing. This kind of total collapse of the pages and the extreme heat.
You will see that the presentation on my first presentation on Tuesday and the one yesterday in the seminar, they all do somehow coalesce around issues or problems in the philosophy of history. And they may not look like they're about the same topic. They are not in some content sense, but they are as far as a certain set of theoretical premises are concerned. And I was explaining to Margaret and others before we got going today that, you know, I'm not an academic interpreter of Benjamin. I am someone inspired by Benjamin. And that means that I use him. And I also want to say that this is a political choice, not to simply follow or bow down in front of the great man, Walter Benjamin, because if he has given us tools with which to work, then it's up to us to work with them, and not to simply cite his beautiful language, but to try to make something with it, to try to actually work with it. And through my own writings, that's precisely what I try to do. I mean, a book like Hegel and Universal History maybe never mentions Walter Benjamin, but it could not have been written without his influence. So it's in that spirit that I would like you to accept my thoughts this afternoon. And I also want to make clear that the context in which this text was written. This one tries very hard to deal with theoretical issues in a harder, more difficult theoretical language, but it was instigated by a particular occasion. And I wanted to give you that context before I went into the written text itself. Could we have the first picture?